So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start the slideshow from the beginning, and I think this is going to be fine because I'm looking at the comments on my phone, but I've got my phone on mute, so we shouldn't get any bounce back of sound. So welcome to the advanced reading comprehension session. Thank you very much everyone for coming. My name is Jane Slinn and I'm the Director of Independent Thinkers Education, and we've been providing one-on-one tuition and courses for comprehension across a range of subjects, but in English comprehension, especially focusing on entrance to the most academically competitive independent schools for over 5 years now. And I personally have been supporting students for close to 20 years. Very briefly about my own background. So I studied English at King's College, Cambridge, and I went on and did my master's and PhD degrees there. And I taught at the university for a while. I then went on and worked as a barrister for a short period of time, and then I set up my educational consultancy. So session objectives. So there's potentially a lot to get through. Obviously, I can't go through all the questions on all of the papers because there isn't time to do that. So I've got quite ambitious session objectives. So hopefully we'll get through quite a lot today. So this is what I want to do is give you, and I hope you've got the parents that are watching have got their kids with them as well, to give you some key strategies for the challenging comprehension papers. I want to talk a little bit about what to do if you get an English comprehension paper where you have no mark allocation, and that's, I appreciate this is a small constituency or a subset of a larger constituency, but that's particularly the case for the St Paul's Girls' School questions. We're going to look at how to approach a character analysis question, how to structure longer PQE responses, and then finally we're going to turn and look at the technical components of a sonnet, and I'm going to give you some key technical vocabulary for analysing sonnets, and we'll do some first steps in analysing a Shakespeare sonnet. So I'm going to start with some general tips for comprehension. You know, you will get different views from different people that will vary slightly, but this is what I would do if I were going into a comprehension exam. So first of all, I'd read the passage through once to get a sense. It's a good idea to get a sense of what the passage is about. Obviously, you usually have a couple of sentences at the beginning that also give you a little bit of information. Read those. They will often give you keys to what's going on, especially if it's a difficult passage. It will often give you a kind of clue to what it's about. But read the passage through once, then read the questions. So get a sense of the passage, then read the questions, then go back and do your more detailed reading of the passage. In general, answer the questions in the order they're presented on the paper. However, you don't have to do that. So, for example, the NLCS paper I shared, interestingly, there are questions at the beginning of the paper that ask you to sort of have a knowledge of the passage as a whole, or that your answer should be informed by an understanding of the passage as a whole. So when you have those kinds of questions, if you want to get done the slightly more straightforward questions that are on a specific paragraph or a specific phrase, get those done first and then go back. Doesn't matter what order you do them in, just make sure that you do your timing okay. And then final point, final tip, and I know others actually have emphasized this as well, for each question, go back to the relevant part of the passage and reread it before you write. So the sample question that I'm going to go through as a kind of warm-up question in a minute is this NLCS 2014 paper question number 3. Now, the examiner's actually been really nice here. They've told you that the answer that they are seeking is in the second paragraph. Now, what quite a lot of candidates will do is they'll read the passage through quite quickly and they go, oh yeah, I get what's going on. And then they'll look at the questions and they'll jump in, and actually they'll have remembered details incorrectly. So don't, when you're answering the question, rely on your memory from just reading the article or just reading the passage. Actually go back and look at the relevant part of the text before you write. So many candidates, when I'm tutoring and I see this, especially quite confident boys, they jump in with an answer and actually they've skim read the passage quite quickly, they haven't got an accurate recall, and they end up making errors and dropping marks which they really don't need to drop and they really shouldn't be dropping. So those are a few kind of general points of general strategy for comprehension. Okay, so talking now about particular tips. Read the question extremely carefully. This is another absolute classic, and I see it, we're preparing students for university entrance at the moment, and I also used to see it when I was marking people's essays at Cambridge. People answer the question they want to see, not the question that is actually in front of them. And a lot of the recent research on how people's brains work in psychology and neuroscience around biases tells you that, you know, we all read what we want to see. So for goodness sake, read the question carefully. I know that a lot of tests, obviously ISEB has always been online, but these longer comprehension papers tend to have been physical papers, but, you know, in a slight sort of strange period at the moment with COVID, we don't know what's going to be online, what's going to be in person. But if you're doing the physical, you know, if you're doing the paper in person, underline the key words in the question. And one way to really make sure that you do this, or to say, you know, for example, tip to give to your child, read the question and then rephrase what you're being asked. So ask yourself, the candidate, the child should ask him or herself, what exactly am I being asked? Next point, how's the examiner helped you answer the question? So we're going to look at that, a worked example of that in the, or several worked examples of that in the questions that we work through in the session. But for example, in the one that I just showed you that we're going to look up in a minute, the examiner's actually telling you the answers in the second paragraph. Another classic error that I see with children is they will read the question, which is, you know, we're told Tom and Becky wander off from the others, and then they'll give an answer that was not in the second paragraph. You could give the most brilliant answer ever and do some wonderful literary analysis and incredibly kind of perceptive and sensitive reading, but unfortunately, if you're doing that incredibly perceptive and sensitive reading on paragraph 4, not paragraph 2, you get 0 marks. Okay, so talked a little bit about picking out keywords that help you provide on focusing an accurate answer. Look at the question words. So those will give you clues. So we see some different varieties of these. So we might see what, might see in what ways, but generally speaking, with a how question, that's going to include some literary analysis, because it's how does the writer achieve this particular fact, or this, how does the writer convey this idea? How does the writer encourage or make the reader feel a certain way? So when you see how, that is going to be a literary analysis question. Not always, and you'll see some examples on the papers that I've provided where a what question is not this, but often a what question is asking for factual information, so it's extracting details, and a why question is obviously giving reasons. So you might end up in a why question using quite a lot of becauses, for example, or for this reason type phrases. So these words are giving you clues about the kind of answer you need to give. So look at them carefully. So, you know, when you've got a how question, we're going to talk about a paraphrase question for the Shakespeare towards the end of this talk. But when you've got a how question, that's telling you need to quote from the text and analyze the text. When you've got an in your own words question, do not quote from the text. So, you know, we'll come back to that. And then look at how many marks there are for the question. Obviously, the St. Paul's paper doesn't give the mark allocation. I'm going to give you some strategies for dealing with that when we get to that. Okay, so this is the warm-up question. In the second paragraph, we're told that Tom and Becky wander off from the others. How does the writer communicate their separation from the rest of the party? So here's the second paragraph. Everyone should have it in front of you, because I shared the files with Saba, and Saba shared the files with the members of the group. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to this point of how has the examiner helped you answer this question. So would anyone like to type in their ideas? I hope there's some kids watching and not just parents, but parents are are welcome to participate. How is the examiner, what kind of clues and hints do we need to look at in the question that will help us get the best possible answer for this question? So I know there's a little bit of a lag, but I've got my phone here so I can see any messages, any comments people type in. So somebody please. Yes, absolutely, excellent. You've said it's telling us which paragraph. So I kind of hinted at that, but you know, that is crucial. It's telling us which paragraph. So that's actually already making the question a lot easier, because there's only a short amount of text in which we can find the answer. So absolutely excellent. Okay, someone's saying we're told extra detail. Okay, could you say a little bit more there? About the type of detail. Okay, so I'm going to go, just because we've got quite a lot to get through today, I'm going to go to what I've picked out. So one excellent we had there from Yavika or her daughter, I think. So we're looking actually here at the question. So I think someone here is people are now moving on to actually answering the question, so that's fine. So very quickly, the clues in the question are telling you where to find the answer. What's the key word? It's separation. So it's the point that this is the point where these two children wander off and they are separate from the other children. That's what it's asking about. And it's a how question, so you need to quote from the text. So what I've done here is I've put the paragraph on the slide. I actually noticed, and this was on the paper, I actually noticed a spelling mistake on the paper, which is obviously not great, which it should be they wandered with a W, not wandered with an O, which is wandered, you know, I wonder, I wondered, you know, I wonder as in I'm thinking about something. So in fact, we can bracket off the stuff about the hide and seek frolicking, because that's not what the question is about. It's about when they go off by themselves. So they wandered off down a sinuous, great word there, avenue. And then there's the bit at the end, which Sibaji has here, still drifting along and talking, they scarcely noticed they were now in a part of the cave whose walls were not frescoed. So it's that part of the passage that we really need to look at, because that's the bit where they've kind of, they have separated from the other children. So so going back to the question, how does the writer communicate their separation? What do we notice about this final bit of the paragraph? So I'm going to give you a kind of leading question here. So in so a fresco is a painting on a wall. So for example, we still have some Roman frescoes. If you go to Italy, you'll see Roman frescoes in some of their villas and some of their buildings. Some churches in the UK still have frescoes from the Renaissance and from the prior to that, from the pre-Reformation period. Some of those are still preserved on the walls of churches. So a fresco is like a painting on the wall. So why might the fact that there are no frescoes on the part of the building that they get to, or the part of the caves they get to, why might that be symbolic? Thinking about answering this question, why might that be symbolic? Or what might it be symbolic of? I'm sorry, that's my cat shouting in the background. We can ignore him. Any ideas here of what this might be symbolic of? The fact that there are no frescoes on the wall. Yeah, okay, good point there. Good point. That's a different place, maybe somewhere they shouldn't be. What do frescoes indicate? So human beings paint frescoes. So what do frescoes indicate? Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So it's showing exactly. So it's showing that Okay, yeah, earlier they were looking at them. Yeah, absolutely. So it's symbolic of them being separated from the rest of the group because they're no longer in a part of the caves that have these indications of human activity. So what I've done here is I've written a sample on, bear in mind this is a sample answer. Yeah, excellent. People haven't been there. Absolutely. From Anshu, they're brilliant. So I've written a sample answer here. It's a sample, it's not a model answer. But what I've done here is I've highlighted several things. So the writer shows, so I've done that. How does the writer communicate? So what I'm doing here is I've highlighted that in yellow because I wanted to use different vocabulary from the vocabulary used in the question. That's always a great thing to be able to do in a comprehension, is show the range of vocabulary for your child, to show the range of vocabulary he or she has by using synonyms for the words in the question. So the writer shows that Tom and Becky are isolated. Again, I used isolated, not separated from their friends, by describing them as reaching a part of the cave whose walls were not frescoed. And I've color coded this. So the point is basically in yellow, the quote is in green, and then the analysis is in pink and blue. And the points that the words that I've highlighted in blue are synonyms. So basically using different language from the language used in the question. So that's just to give you a quick warm up, quick idea of how we might go about answering this type of question. Now, this question only has 2 marks. So we've done 1 PQE here. What happens, which we'll see as we go through the presentation, is that you often get these questions with multiple PQEs. And so for those questions, you'll want to use this structure or use this strategy, but repeat it several times over. Okay, so the next question we're going to look at is from the St. Paul's paper. And I've put up this as an original illustration of the book when it was published in the 1890s. What kind of person is the narrator? Write a paragraph about him, mentioning 3 separate things that he says or does and what these tell us about him. Okay, so this kind of question, this is quite a tricky question, because you've got to, in contrast to the previous question where you're told write about paragraph 2, here you've got to write about, really you can take points from the whole text, and it's talking about asking you to give an overview from the whole text. Okay, so first of all, I'm now going to talk, before we go on to the kind of substantive issue of what material to put in your answer, I'm going to talk about how to approach questions with no mark allocation. Okay, so even though there is no mark allocation, there are quite a lot of clues on the paper. So 1, how much space is there? Sounds obvious, but where they give you, like a paper like that where you're given space to write your answers, yes, you usually get a bit of overflow paper that you can use as well, but really you should not be writing, for example, double oh, someone's just asking a question. We're just doing selected questions from the papers, because we haven't got, it's not going to be viable to do the whole paper. I mean, if I did 3 whole papers, we'd be here probably for 3 hours. Okay, so back to this point, about space on the paper. Broadly speaking, you need to stick within that. Yes, you can get extra sheets of paper to continue your answers, but realistically, if you're ending up writing 2 sides when you're given one, most of one side for an answer, you're writing too much. What have you been asked for? Have you been asked to provide a certain number of examples? Well, yes, you have. In this case, if we go back to the question, write 3 separate things. So you have been asked. You've been asked for 3 things. What else have you been asked for? Okay, in this case, you've been asked for your view of the narrator's character plus examples and analysis. So that's important, because sometimes you'll get a question that will just say something like, write down a metaphor or a simile, or pick out the part of the article that does, the part of the passage in which, write down the part of the passage in which, I don't know, it conveys the writer's feelings or something like that. So here, very clearly, you've been asked to write about 3 examples and also to explain them. So actually what they're looking for here is basically a kind of 3 PQE paragraph. That's what they're looking for. So depending on how you marked that, in most comprehension exams, we'd be looking at, someone else has asked a question. Yeah, I will, okay, great. Okay, so someone's already answered the question here. Okay, let me come to these questions in a moment. I'll just finish talking about this slide. So basically we've got a 3 PQE question that is usually, depending on exactly how they calculate the marks, would be sort of between 9 and 12 marks on a paper. Look at the question in relation to the rest of the paper. So that's also quite good. You could work out your timing based on that. So I would say here about 15 minutes answering the question. Okay, so in answer to these practical questions, do we receive extra paper if we run out of space? I think you usually get some additional paper to write on. Sometimes people will need to cross stuff out, etc., or continuation, or you can write on the back of the paper. I mean, those instructions should be clear. Should be clear on the paper. Sorry, someone's saying, do we do the question we didn't do? Sorry, I don't understand that. If you could explain your question. So someone here has already has already put some answers here for the question, so I'll come to that now. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is I'm also, as well as going through specific paper questions from specific papers, I'm also trying to give you a kind of framework of how to approach these questions. So you often get sorry, someone's saying, okay, so someone's saying, yeah, if you I'm going to come to what I'm going to provide people with at the end of the talk. So let me talk about, yeah, I mean, surely if you want to do the paper after the meeting, that's fine. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is how we answer this particular question, but it's also a general point about how we do character analysis questions, because these often come up, and often what you will need to do is you will need to piece together what we know of the character from clues in the passage. And there are a number of reasons why we might do this. Not everything about a character is stated explicitly. If you have a narrative like this, which is a first person narrative, if you have a narrative like this, which is a first person narrative, you then do not have so when you have what we sometimes call an omniscient third person narrator, is you doing quite a lot of novels, that narrator then comments on the character, right, on the characters that are introduced. But here, or even if you have an unreliable narrator, that narrator comments on the characters that were introduced. Here, because we've got a first person narrator, we haven't got anybody commenting on the characters. So that being the case, we have to deduce and infer things about the narrator from what he says himself and from what's presented to us in the passage. So what I've given you here is a set of questions that you might want to ask yourself in order to answer these kind of character questions. So firstly, how does the character behave, including towards others? Now, we don't have a huge amount of information about how this character is behaving towards other people in this passage. But how does the character behave, including towards others? How does the character respond to what's happening? In this particular case, how does the narrator react to the Martian? What does the narrator say about himself? What is he feeling and thinking? what sort of language does he use? So this particular character, I think that would be responding at a level that wouldn't be expected at 11, would be responding at a level that wouldn't be expected at 11 plus. But this particular character actually uses quite a lot of melodramatic language. It's almost like he's quite self-dramatizing. He's enjoying the he's enjoying, sorry, someone is saying excuse me, I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not sure what I wanted to repeat here, but this character is enjoying the drama of this situation. So looking for literary techniques, imagery, and vocabulary that you can analyze. And then I've put these two questions in brackets because they don't apply to this specific character, which are, or this specific passage, because there aren't, I mean, there are other people in the passage, but none of them says anything at this point. So what do others say about him? And if you've got dialogue, what transpires in that dialogue? Okay, so I've given you a set of questions here. The thing about how does the narrator react to the Martian, clearly that is not applicable to all novels, but how does the narrator react to the situation in front of him? That's applicable to any novel you might study. So somebody here has already answered the question, and they've done that very well, in fact. So I'm just scrolling back on my phone on the comments here. The point about him being brave, absolutely. I added in something here. I said, but there's a sense of self-preservation, isn't there? I had a momentary impulse to go back and help him that my fears overruled. So he's not without, he's not careless. He may be brave, but he's not reckless, let's say. Going back to the beginning here, he's curious. Yeah, again, Sibaj picked that out, but lots of quotations you could use here. I picked up one from the second paragraph, but lots of quotations about his curiosity and looking at the detail throughout the passage. Look at the detail in which he describes the Martian. You know, there's really a lot of descriptive language there and a lot of detail. So he's really fascinated and really interested and really observant. And the other point that I put in that is different is from here is, you know, he's someone, isn't he? He seems to be driven by his feelings. So even this point about courage, I had an impulse to go back, but my fears overruled. And this great metaphor, I was a battleground of fear and curiosity. So he doesn't, at this point, seem to be being presented. Actually, it differs in the rest of the novel or in other parts of the novel. But at this part of the novel, we're not really seeing a particularly rational human being. We're seeing somebody who's governed by fears and governed by passions. So anyone got anything else they'd like to contribute? I've been quite comprehensive there, but anything else you'd like to contribute about the kind of person that the narrator is? Anything you think I've missed here? So I'm just waiting to see if there are any comments. If not, I can move on. Okay. So, I mean, I guess the only other thing that I thought one might say, but I just wanted to put 3 points on the slide because I think we need 3 PQEs to answer the question, and you're only asked for 3 examples. The only other thing I thought that one might want to say about him is, okay, sure, this story is about some human beings who've been going around, you know, going on with their lives happily in Surrey, the Garden of England, or no, is that Kent? And some aliens land on the local, some aliens land on a local common or green area, and they go and investigate them. Now, there's also when the narrator describes the aliens as, or the Martian as unspeakably horrible or unspeakably awful, or unspeakably horrid, or whatever the phrasing is, I thought the only other thing you could possibly say about the narrator is maybe he's quite judgmental. You know, he's curious about these other creatures, but he's also very condemnatory of them. Okay, so what I'm now giving you here is an example answer. I haven't written out the whole answer, but what I've done is I've written out the first PQE, PEE, PEA paragraph, PQA paragraph. People differ in terms of acronyms. And what I've also introduced here is I've said, if you've got one of these multiple PQE questions, what is really impressive, and you might end up doing this having written out your 3 PQEs, is if you can do it like a mini essay. So what I mean by that is you actually have a sentence at the beginning where you pull together all the points that you want to make. So I've given you an example that here the passage presents the narrator as perceptive and fascinated by what he discovers in the world, highly emotional, and to a large extent courageous. And the reason that I've highlighted in yellow is then what you then do is you go through each point in turn. And so the first PQE point is then there in your the first point in your introductory sentence is then there as your first point in your first PQE. The narrator is highly observant and intellectually curious. And what I've also done here, you'll see, is I've tried to vary the vocabulary so I don't end up just reusing the same words in answering the question. And so then we've got the quotation, and then done a little bit of analysis here. The comparison of the Martian's eyes to luminous discs creates a vivid image of the alien, highlighting the narrator's powers of observation. So all of these details that you're given about the alien shows how curious and how observant this person, what it is a man, this man is. While the phrase something stirring in the shadow, it creates that sense of anticipation, a sense of mystery and excitement that is being shared by the narrator with the reader. And then I've just added a sentence kind of summing up, this is clearly a man intrigued by the world around him. You would then go on and do 2 more PQEs, and then you would have a conclusion where you would wrap up. Again, you know, it is they've been asked to write a paragraph, it's not a full essay. So what you then do is you wrap up with 1 sentence that gives an overview. So you use vocabulary like to conclude. In some, we see that the narrator is, intrigued, but also repelled by the Martians, that he is not particularly rational, but that he does have a large amount of courage, or that he is brave. So again, I'm trying to find synonyms here, so you don't just end up using the same words. So what we're now going to do in the rest of the session, and I will also leave a bit of time at the end for questions, is we're going to talk about Shakespeare Sonnet 29. So what I've done here is I've given you, and actually there's going to be a qualification to this a little bit later in this session, but I've given you the rhyme scheme for a sonnet. So a sonnet is a 14-line lyric poem. Sonnets were first written in the Renaissance, first by Petrarch, earlier, Petrarch sort of 14th, 15th century, then by Shakespeare in the 16th and the 17th century, and they go on, people still write sonnets today. So here you'll see these slides. I'm going to go through the kind of factual stuff. Yeah, it is quite hard. The vocabulary is quite hard, so I'm going to help with that. And that's why in the version that I shared with the group prior to the session, I scanned and glossed loads of the more difficult vocabulary. So the point about this is just to give you a bit of an introduction to a Shakespeare sonnet. As I said, I've written the rhyme scheme out here. There's going to be some qualification to this, but generally speaking, a Shakespearean sonnet will rhyme like this: A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. Now, a sonnet contains a change of mood or perspective. Again, this is going to be qualified when we do the analysis, but usually in the Shakespearean sonnet, you get that turn of mood, that turn of perspective, what the Italian call the volta, in the last two lines. And one thing to say at this point, yeah, I'm going to talk about the meaning. What we're actually going to do is we're actually going to go through some questions on the sonnet. So then we will, I'll be explaining the meaning then. So what you'll find where you've got a piece of verse that is written, in fact, there are very few fixed verse forms in England, in English verse, but where you've got a piece of verse that's written in a fixed verse form, like a sonnet, you know, it's got a certain structure that is laid down. One of the things you then might be looking for, and we're going to come to this when we answer one of the questions, one of the things that you then might be looking for when you analyze the sonnet is how that verse, how the particular sonnet you have in front of you might depart from those conventions. So what I mean by that is, I've given you the rhyme scheme for a Shakespearean sonnet here. I've told you that the volta, or the turn, usually occurs in the last two lines, but we're also going to look in relation to this sonnet, does it vary, that rhyme scheme, and does the volta actually come in, or the turn come in a different place? Because when that happens, what the writer's doing is departing from a convention and thereby emphasizing those particular parts of his text. So then that's a point where that should be kind of ringing some bells with you and getting you to think about, why is this different? What does it put emphasis on? What are the lines that are different? Okay, so sonnets, just back to some general comments on sonnets very briefly. Originally written as love poems, first by Petrarch, and you get Petrarchan sonnets as well in the English Renaissance, written in English, not in Italian. But then people write sonnets about many other things. So we've got very famous sonnets, like, for example, Anthem for Doomed Youth, that famous First World War poem, is a sonnet. So you get people writing about love, but then writing about death, religion, war. And this is one of my favorite sonnets, which we're not going to analyze today. But okay, so someone's saying, what is a sonnet? So I've given you a definition here, a 14-line lyric poem written in iambic pentameter that has a quite rigid rhyme scheme. And there are different types of sonnet. The type we're talking about today is the English sonnet, and the rhyme scheme is there for you. So I've done the rhyme scheme on the poem there. And I appreciate we're going through the slides quite quickly. As I say, these are going to be shared in the group after the session, so you can look at them at your leisure. Okay, so this is a little bit of a diversion, but a favourite sonnet of mine by William Wordsworth, written in the early 19th century, about writing sonnets. So you can write a sonnet on almost anything. And here this is a sonnet in which Wordsworth is saying, people think that sonnets are kind of boring and limiting, but actually when we ask ourselves to write a sonnet, so we impose that restriction on ourselves. In truth, the prison into which we doom ourselves no prison is, and hence for me in sundry moods 'twas pastime to be bound within the sonnet's scanty plot of ground. So he's using a spatial metaphor, a metaphor of place and space there to describe the sonnet. Okay, so let's now go on and talk about this particular Shakespeare sonnet and a little bit about techniques and strategies for responding to poetry. Okay, so first thing, think about form and language as choices made by the poet to achieve specific effects. In the case of the sonnets, no, a sonnet isn't an ode is a different form. So they're both lyric poems, but a sonnet isn't an ode. So yeah, great question there. Okay, so think about form and language as choices made by the poet to achieve specific effects. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, if I choose to write a sonnet, I'm Shakespeare, I choose to write a sonnet, I'm writing it knowing that Petrarch has written love sonnets, so people are going to be expecting me to write a love poem in writing a sonnet. And I'm also going to be making choices about the way I express myself in words, about the rhymes that that are designed to achieve a particular response in my audience, right? Second, look for repetition and patterns. In the sonnet, one of the forms of repetition that we have is the rhyme scheme, and that's also a pattern, if you like, but there are other forms of repetition as well. So in particular in this, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, in this sonnet, we've got the repetition of the word state, and we've got a classic thing that you find in Shakespeare, you find it in the plays. And remember, many of the plays, the majority of the important speeches, if you like, in the plays are written in verse. So Macbeth's soliloquies and Macbeth's speeches are written in verse, Othello's soliloquies are written in verse. These are blank verse plays, and they're written in iambic pentameter like the sonnet. So you're looking for repetition of particular words, particular language, particular aspects of form. Shakespeare uses a lot of figurative language. Most poets do, but Shakespeare in particular. So if you're in a situation where you think you might be asked to analyse some Shakespeare, one of the things you can have in your head is look for those metaphors, look for those similes. And I'm going to talk about a simile that is used in this particular poem and how that simile operates really quite complexly on a number of levels. Look for unfamiliar uses of words. So a word that we might expect to see in one context used in a different context. Why? Because if a word that we expect to see in context A is used in context B, I think it automatically makes us think about it and maybe think, is there something different going on here? Is the writer trying to communicate a new idea? What's he trying to say or she trying to say? And then also looking for dramatic, powerful and striking vocabulary. And then finally, paying attention to syntax, lineation and punctuation. Lineation is a fancy word for saying how the words operate on lines. So I'm not going to have time to talk about this today in relation to this poem, but we were looking for, if we go back here to the Shakespeare Sonnet, looking for enjambed lines, for example, that would be, or enjambment, that would be a lineation point. So if we look at the line, haply I think on thee and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth sings at heaven's gate, you've actually got a quite long enjambed line there, haven't you? A long or a run on line, sometimes people call it, where haply to gate, there is no, yeah, there's the parenthesis, but there's no pause or punctuation there. Okay, so the first question we're going to look at together is, oh, okay, so someone's asking what syntax is. Syntax is basically the order in which words are arranged grammatically on, yeah. So the arrangement of sentences and the grammatical rules which structure sentences. Yeah, someone's already picked out the simile. Okay, excellent. Like to the lark at break of day arising, brilliant. What I want to do before we get on to talking about the simile is I want to just look at this in your own words question and give you a few tips here. So in your own words, describe the speaker's mood in the first 4 lines of the poem. Okay, happily means, okay, luckily. If we could, I will explain, but if we could just look at these first 4 lines and then before we get on to that. So the word hap, so this is where that we have happening in, the word hat or word happenstance, which probably not many people use now, but the original root meaning is one of kind of luck. So, okay, in your own words, describe the speaker's mood in the first 4 lines of the poem. So what I've done here is I've put the first 4 lines up and I've picked out the words that I think we need to focus on when we're thinking about the speaker's mood. So here we've got, and I think this helps you answer the question, because you've then got in disgrace, all alone. Beweep is a fancy Renaissance way of saying weep. Obviously, we would not in modern English saying, I beweep my terrible situation, even if were we to find ourselves in one. Outcast, deaf heaven, cries and curse my fate. So what I've done is I've picked out all the words which I think communicate most strongly what this speaker is feeling. We've got an interesting sort of compressed personification there in deaf heaven, the idea of heaven not listening, you know, being impervious to this this person's cries. So would anyone like to have a go at putting, I've got an example answer on the next slide, but having picked out these key words, and the point about an in your own words question, and this happens all the time, I see it when I'm teaching kids, they kind of ignore in your own words and they quote from the text. Do not quote from the text in your own words question. It's asking you to explain what's happening in the passage and show that you understand it by using your own words, not the words in the texts. Yes, okay, on shoot. Yeah, I agree with that. That's a good point. Feeling that his destiny and status isn't good enough to live a perfect life. I agree with that, and there's a lot of punning on this word state, which I'm going to come back to. But is it more than that? Is it more than saying destiny and status isn't good enough? Because I think that this person, yes, he's playing on the idea of status throughout the poem. Right, yeah, great, Sibaji there. Yeah, absolutely, I agree with that. He feels hopeless. He thinks his wishes will never be granted. I agree with that. And there's this sense of kind of impotence, of calling up to heaven. And remember, this is a period, whatever one's own beliefs are now, I think it is true to say that we broadly live in a secular society. Remember, 16th, 17th century Britain is a religious society. So people go to church. Religion is an important part of people's lives, and people do actually believe that if they entreat God and pray to God, God will answer their prayers. So this point about deaf heaven probably has more power than it would have. Yeah, okay, so Shakespeare is forlorn, fantastic word. They're sick and tired of his fate, very good. Yuvika, yeah, no one cares about him, definitely. So I would want to pull out, in answering the in your own words bit, I would want to pull out I all alone. Obviously, we've got some nice alliteration there as well, but the idea that he is alone in this, he is abandoned, he has not got anybody to share his suffering with. Morose, another great word. Despair, yeah, some really brilliant stuff here. I've given an answer. This is what I've written as an example. I've actually used different, there's lots of words here like morose, forlorn, solitary. Yeah, he is by himself. Hopeless, that you could use as well. I've given an example of what I think works as an answer here, and then I've just put a couple of highlighted tips. Don't quote from the text, and make sure you use synonyms. If you're stuck with a synonym, we tend to think of a synonym because we're thinking, or maybe we don't, but if you're in that kind of verbal reasoning mindset, we're thinking of synonyms as a word that means the same as another word. But actually, if you're stuck and you can't come up with a directly equivalent word, then what you can do is come up with a phrase instead. But we've got some great synonyms here of forlorn, hopeless, etc. Okay, so we're now going to look at this slightly more difficult question, I think. How does Shakespeare present the speaker's change of mood in lines 11 to 14? In your answer, select two literary techniques and explain their effects. So this answer is I was talking about the 3 PQE question for the St. Paul's paper. This is a 2 PQE question. And what I've done here is I've drawn attention to several things we might write about. Now, clearly, if you were actually answering the question, you would need to pick 2 of these. You wouldn't be able to write about 5 things, or you can write about 5 things, but it would be pointless because you then have spent an inordinate amount of time on this question, probably at the expense of other questions. Okay, someone's just saying, would it be right to copy the phrase in another order? No, it wouldn't, because you've been asked to come up with your own words with synonyms, so you can't just take the words. I mean, obviously you can. If you take the words and you rearrange them, you're not answering the question. So because you're not putting it in your own words. You're simply the question is not rearrange the words in a different order. The question is in your own words. So no. Okay, so going back to this, how does Shakespeare present the speaker's change of mood? So I think what's important here, and I know someone was asking about a general understanding of the poem, so I'm just going to click back here to the whole poem. We've got a strong understanding now, I think, from that first question of what this poem is about. So it's about feeling isolated and abandoned and alone, and feeling pity for yourself and feeling sorry for yourself. And then, and this bit isn't in the questions, but then we've got jealousy of others, desiring this man's art and that man's scope. So I've scanned those words for you, but basically being jealous of other people's skills and other people's possessions, with what I most enjoy contented least. Nice contrast there. No longer what we sometimes call anhedonia, no longer taking pleasure in the things that the writer is, or the speaker is, accustomed to take pleasure in. And then suddenly we've got this turn here, happily, so suddenly, by chance, is the hap, I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at the break of day arising from sullen earth, sings at hymns at heaven's gate. So suddenly we've got this change, we've got this change in tone and change in mood, from misery and dejection and moroseness to feeling uplifted and happy. So one person already, I said for Shakespeare, always go for the figurative language. So here, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings at heaven's gate. Now, the reason that I've highlighted these phrases within the simile is actually the simile is quite this simile is quite complicated, because it seems like we've got a fairly straightforward simile here. So he's comparing his mood, comparing himself to being like a lark, to being like a spring bird at break of day. But then we've got another comparison here from sullen earth. So there's an implied comparison that the way he felt before was sullen earth, and now he feels like the lark. And then we've also got this association of religious language. And I talked a little bit earlier in the session about how, remember, it doesn't matter what any of our own personal beliefs are, Britain in 16th, 17th century, or it wasn't even Britain then, it was England in the 16th and 17th century, is a religious culture, and it is a Christian culture. So to be describing this lark as singing hymns at heaven's gate is kind of like saying, in 16th or 17th century speak, this lark is experiencing the most wonderful joy that you can experience in our culture, because this lark is singing hymns of celebration at heaven's gate, at the place at which we, English Christians of the 16th and 17th century all aspire to go. So actually, when we look at that simile, and this is entirely typical of Shakespeare, whether you're looking at the blank verse in his plays or you're looking at the sonnets, you've got quite a complex simile operating on lots of different levels to communicate the speaker's change of mood. So you've got that contrast between sullen, dead earth and this lively lark, and then you've got what you might want to comment on, and you've got the conventional association of kind of daybreak, the symbolic, the new day, rebirth, etc., etc. There's a poem by Shelley written in the early 19th century called To a Skylark that takes advantage of all of that kind of symbolism. And then you've got this association with Christianity and with religious language. So look for patterns of repetition in Shakespeare. So here, interestingly, we've got, and actually I've made a mistake in my numbering here, point 2 and point 3 are actually the same thing. So why is this noun state important in the poem? If we go back to the whole text here, we've got, I all alone beweep my outcast state, so my situation of being abandoned and rejected by everybody. And then that word state again, we've got at the end of line 10, then my state sings hymns at heaven's gate. So we've got that there. And then we've got finally, that I scorn to change my state with kings. So we've got classic Shakespeare here of punning on the many meanings of this word state. Here it's talking more about the kind of the position, the status of a king. So you've both got status, situation or predicament, if you like, and state as a place in the hierarchy. And then that really, when you get to the final line, that really brings home what this speaker is trying to say, because he's saying, I'm so happy that I become close to God and I sing hymns at heaven's gate, or I'm like a lark singing hymns at heaven's gate, which is close to God, but I'm also metaphorically rich, for thy sweet love such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Doesn't mean that because he is remembering how in love he is with the woman that he's addressing, that therefore he's suddenly his own personal situation changes and he's suddenly hugely wealthy. But metaphorically, he feels that his situation is so wonderful that he would then not want to change place with a king. And remember, 16th, 17th century Britain, highly hierarchical society in which it's much more difficult to rise from the bottom. Well, we have all kinds of controversies about this now, but it is more difficult to rise from the bottom to the top of that society, and where people's class and people's status is largely determined by class. So talking about feeling in love with you makes me feel so wonderful that I don't want to change my state with kings is more meaningful in the 16th or 17th century than it is now. So I'm just going to wrap up what I'm saying now. And this was my point that I introduced earlier, where I said, where you have a piece of writing that follows a quite rigid or quite fixed convention, like the sonnet, and we don't have many of those types of conventions in English verse in the way that we do have, for example, in French verse. We don't have as many set forms as we do. But when you use something like the sonnet, what happens when you depart from what's expected? So that's my final point here, is there anything unexpected here? So I said to you that usually the Shakespearean sonnet, the volta or turn is in the final two lines. There is a volta or turn in the final two lines going back there, because we've got this kind of epithet of, when I remember your love, it's so wonderful, I don't want to change my place with a king. But at the same time, I think we've also got a turn where we would expect to see, actually, no, sorry, not all we'd expect to see it. But we've actually also got a turn, arguably, where we would expect to see it in a Petrarchan sonnet after the first 8 lines, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. So that yet is introducing that qualification or that contrast, and that's where I think the mood starts to change. So, and then the other point that I had about patterning is, here is one version of that I've got there, the ABAB of the rhyme scheme of this poem. But I think that I've put it here, in fact, we've got something slightly different here, haven't we? Because we've got that the sonnet rhymes ABAB, CD, CD, and the second CD is the D is a half rhyme. And then we've got EB, GG. So what we've actually got, if we go back, if we look at the poem, we've got state, fate, state again, and then gate. So there's almost a kind of circling effect that Shakespeare's creating in his poem there, that he's taking us back. He's using this word state and talking about how miserable he is, the speaker is at the beginning of the poem, and then he's revisiting his state in the line, happily I think on thee and then my state, and he's revising it. So okay, someone's saying that she can't hear. Can everyone else hear? I don't know. So there's a sense in which the poem has gone full circle, or it's traveled from a state of depression to a state of elation, and that is reflected, that mood is reflected in the rhyme scheme. So has anyone got, I'm going to finish now because I know I've used up my hour. Has anyone got any questions from any of this? I know it's been quite a whistle stop tour looking at a few questions. So if anyone would like to type questions, if that's okay, Saba, I will answer some questions. Excuse me. Okay, so everyone's saying yes. Oh, okay, they can hear, right? Okay, so any questions? Okay, well, I think, Sabaji, that what Shakespeare is saying is, you know, I talked about the sonnet as conventionally a love poem. So I don't think he is saying he's forlorn. What he's saying is, I suppose it's a good question. I suppose it's a good question in that one could read the poem. This is a kind of level of complexity that I don't think is expected at 11 plus or even 13 plus, but one could read the poem as Shakespeare, and this is how some literary critics might read the poem, as Shakespeare is contriving a kind of state of depression or upset in order to then sort of give him occasion to talk about how much he loves his the person that he's addressing in the sonnets. And again, who that is debated by critics. But I guess that the more I would expect a child to do of this poem is that at the beginning he is in a state of depression, he is, as someone says, forlorn, but by the end of the poem he has rescued himself from that. And how has he rescued himself from that state of depression? He's rescued himself from that state of depression by thinking and remembering the person with whom he is in love. Okay, good question here from Vport. Yeah, absolutely. So Shakespeare uses a huge amount of figurative language. He uses lots of similes, lots of metaphors, lots of personification, and he also uses lots of imagery as well, lots of descriptive language, creating vivid images in the reader's mind or the listener's mind or the audience's mind if it's a play. So in sense of kind of transferable skills from the session, absolutely, the things that I've put here, although they're relevant to answering the specific question, they will also help you analyze any bit of Shakespeare. So you get a bit of Shakespeare, look for similes, metaphors, personification, look for patterns, repetition, look for punning. Shakespeare loves punning, and look for anything which you might not expect, especially in a sonnet. So if you know how a Shakespearean sonnet is structured, where the turn tends to be what the rhyme scheme is, look for any departures from that. And you also get in terms of modern poetry, you often get writers writing sonnets. You often get writers writing sonnets that do not exactly follow that scheme. So in answer to your question, Dr. Singh, what if you cannot find figurative language, you need it in the question? I mean, it's unlikely that, okay, sometimes you do get questions. Sometimes you do get questions which ask you to write down a simile or a metaphor. I think that similes are pretty easily identifiable because you'll have like or as. Obviously, a metaphor is a comparison, but without the word like or as. So I think you need to go back. I think if the question explicitly asks you for a metaphor or a simile and you can't find it, I think you need to go back and analyze the text and look for the comparison. If it's what I was also saying slightly more generally was that when you're analysing Shakespeare, let's say the first things, if you've got a question you've got to write about, how does Shakespeare present the speaker in this poem? What I'm saying is, simile, metaphor, personification are used a lot by Shakespeare, so go and have a look and see if they're there. If you find yourself analysing a piece of writing by Shakespeare and they're not there, then look at other things. So look at particularly emotional, particularly dramatic language, look for hyperbole, of deliberate exaggeration, look for a word that, look for punning here. So the punning is basically it's a play on words, is the technical definition. So it's playing on the fact that a word can have more than one meaning. I've put the definition here on the slide. You know, look at the rhyme scheme, look at the rhythm of the poem. Shakespeare, whether he's writing sonnets or whether he's writing poetry in his plays, Shakespeare is writing in blank verse, in iambic pentameter. So look at that and look at the rhyme scheme, look at the rhythm, look at if there's any departure from that. So you know, I'm trying here to give you a bit of a toolkit of things to look for, rather than to say categorically all these things are going to be in every aspect of Shakespeare you watch. Then you read. They're not going to be. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, so I think we've done the hour. I'm just going to put a slide here at the end. We've got some courses coming up, got courses running that are full, but we're opening up new slots in October for advanced English, focusing on poetry and Shakespeare. One group for years 4 to 6, and other groups for years 7 to 9. And we've got interview practice groups for independent schools. But the two of those groups are already full, so we're looking at booking courses in December if anyone is interested. I've got, okay, I'll answer that question in a second. I've put here my own email address and a mailing list sign up. So if you sign up for our mailing list, we'll send you the sample answers for the NLCS paper, and also a full answer to the St. Paul's question. And anyone who signs up for a course will provide you with answers for the Shakespeare questions. Okay, so answer to this question: are you likely to get Shakespeare and Henrietta Barnett? I mean, I think that I know that last year's QE exam did have Shakespeare, did have a Shakespeare passage from Hamlet. My advice for all parents, if you're doing second round for those kind of schools, Henrietta Barnett QE, i.e. the most Tiffin, the most academically selective grammar schools, and for the independent schools, I'm not going to say yes, Shakespeare is going to be in the exam, because Shakespeare is in the exam in the minority of cases. But if you can, I would try and prepare your child for some Shakespeare, because it is possible that it will come up. We don't know, but you know, when you're preparing for any kind of test or assessment, insofar as it is possible, it is a good idea to prepare for any eventuality. And I think it is possible that Henrietta Barnett could set some Shakespeare in the second round, yes. It's probably less likely rather than more likely, but I think it's possible. So that's why I'm saying, I guess that's why I'm saying it's worth thinking about Shakespeare and how you might approach Shakespeare. Definitely, I know this is an 11+ presentation, but definitely at 13+, especially in scholarship papers for top independent schools, you see a lot of Shakespeare. Okay, so thank you very much everyone for coming. I will, I've got one edit I need to make to the slide, and then I will send them to Saba, and she will upload these to the files in the group. And thank you for your answers, those were great. lots of good participation. And I hope that everyone's children, you know, I hope the assessments coming up will go well for you. And as I say, any interesting courses that we've got running, please get in touch with me. And I've got a link here for our mailing list. If you sign up, we'll send you some materials linked to what we talked about today. Okay, so I'm going to stop the slide share and I'm going to stop the video now. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Bye.